And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Starting off this segment with the sea ice analysis. See, the Bering Strait now is iced over here with some fair amount of ice even south of the strait there, closing in on St. Lawrence Island. So going farther south here, you can see, of course, Norton Sound still ice covered with it expanding westward again towards St. Lawrence Island, almost reaching the coast. There was some thin ice developing, extending down now, surrounding most of Nunivak Island on into Kuskokwim Bay. And from there, we'll go to tonight's weather. Big storm coming northward here, bringing gale force winds and rain and snow into northern Bristol Bay by tomorrow morning, with rain spreading into Kodiak Island. A break here coming in across southern Alaska mostly, but just the showers won't end completely for the Prince William Sound area, southern Kenai Peninsula. Light snow continues here along the Brooks Range and back to the northwest coast and the Seward Peninsula there through the Bering Strait. Dry for the southeast coast with light winds. Then for tomorrow, this system low pressure area pulls up to somewhere around Unalaska Island just west of False Pass. Snow and blowing snow pushing into the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta areas, mixing with rain to the south along the front. And also a big increase in the winds and rain, heavy at times for Kodiak Island, and some increasing rain intensities for the southern Kenai Peninsula and Cook Inlet area. Otherwise, the interior looking at gradually increasing winds throughout the day along the western Alaska Range area, but fair here over the Copper River Basin and eastern interior. And variably cloudy with maybe an isolated shower or two possibly there for the southeast coast. And for Monday, that low center pulls back to the northwest here, and this front weakens considerably as it pushes inland. But the continued southerly flow will bring enough warm air in for mixed precipitation all the way up in toward the Kobuk Valley area, with snow and blowing snow for the western Brooks Range on out to the western Arctic coast here, especially from Point Ley all the way down into the Bering Strait. Dry over the eastern interior with gusty south winds through the Alaska Range, and then windy with rain here over south central Alaska and the North Gulf Coast, but not quite reaching the southeast coast. And for the coastal water forecast, we've got on the south coast here, west winds at 10 knots tomorrow. On the central coast, south to southeast winds 10 to 15 knots, and up there to the north, east winds 20 to 30 knots. And for Lynn Canal, north winds at 10 knots, southeast at 15 for Stevens Passage and Clarence Strait with seas 3 to 5 feet. And for Monday, big increase in the winds here as that front approaches from the west. Small craft advisories for the south coast for southeast winds at 30 knots. Small craft advisories also on the central coast. East winds 25 to 30 knots. And even stronger winds on the north coast from the east at 35 to 45 knots. Lynn Canal, Glacier Bay, south at 15, southeast 15, Stevens Passage, and small craft advisories for Clarence Strait for southeast winds at 25 knots with seas building to 9 feet. And for Sunday, Cook Inlet, gale warnings south of the Forelands here, northeast at 35 knots. We've got storm warnings out for the Barren Islands and Kamishak Bay, east winds 50 knots, east of 40 knots for the western North Gulf Coast. Lighter winds as you head east, becoming east-southeast at about 30 knots over through this area, and Prince William Sound, east winds at 25 knots. And then for Monday, Cook Inlet, northeast 25 to 30 knots, east of 40 knots. The winds coming down for both Kamishak Bay and the Barren Islands, with still gale force winds out of the east. And for the North Gulf Coast here, east-southeast winds 40 to 45 knots with seas as high as 21 feet. And now good gale warnings out for the Prince William Sound for Monday. East winds 40 knots, seas 9 feet. Kodiak Island tomorrow, gales are out. East winds 35 to 40 knots, seas 10 to 15 feet. Gale warnings Bristol Bay, east winds at 35. In the Alaska Peninsula, gale warnings on the Pacific side for east-southeast at 35. And east winds at 30 knots for the Bering Sea side. And then for Monday, we've got south to southeast winds for the peninsula here at 20 to 30 knots, and southeast at 30 for Bristol Bay. And now winds coming down to 25 knots from the east and southeast around Kodiak Island. Eastern Aleutians tomorrow, northeast to northwest winds at 25 to 35 knots. Gale warnings for Adak, northwest winds at 35 knots. And then for the western Aleutians, variable winds of 15 to 20 knots. And for the western Aleutians on Monday, north to northwest winds 15 to 20 knots. Much lighter winds for Adak, northeast at 15. And then southwest winds 25 to 30 knots for the eastern Aleutians. For the southwest coast tomorrow, we've got northeast winds 30 to 35 knots. Excuse me. And northeast 25 to 30 for Norton Sound and St. Lawrence. Gosh, excuse me. Northeast gales here for the Pribilof Islands. Northeast 35 knots, these 13 feet. And again, 30-knot winds there from the northeast for St. Matthew Island, Yukon Delta Coast, St. Lawrence Island. And then for the day on Monday, east winds 30 knots here for Norton Sound, St. Lawrence Island, Yukon Delta Coast, gale warnings for the Kuskokwim Delta Coast, southeast at 35 knots, west at 20 for the Pribilofs, and northeast at 30 for St. Matthew Island. And for the eastern Boulevard Sea Coast, brisk wind advisories tomorrow, east-northeast at 25. Right through here, looking at east at 25. Gale warnings for the western Arctic coast, 35 knots out of the east. And lighter winds here from the east and northeast, 15 to 25 knots for the Chukchi Sea. And then on Monday, brisk wind advisories for the Chukchi Sea, east and northeast at 25 to 30 knots. And for the much of the Arctic coast, we're looking at east winds at 30 knots, except the far eastern areas there, Barter Island, Kaktovik toward Demarcation Point, 35-knot winds expected.